Pasamos ya sin más dilación a la siguiente ponencia, que tiene el título Using Stylometry to Model Transmission on Arabic Wisdom Literature in Medieval Europe, the Case of Bocados de Oro. I don't know if you are going to present in Spanish or in English.
I'm speaking in English with Spanish slides.
Okay, wonderful.
I need to get back on this. How do I start on the? It was switched to the other computer. Do I have to reconnect the VGA or?
I think it's already connected there. No.
Sorry. That's all right.
Estamos teniendo unos pequeños problemas técnicos.
The secret switch. Thank you.
There it is.
Thank you. So I'm going to change gears a little bit from the talks that we had this morning about semantic corpora. My talk today is about stylometry, and as a way of modeling transmission in medieval texts. You can find the abstract, and also if you're the sort that likes to play around with things as you hear someone talk, you can see at gjrisley.com in the section my blog on archives for October. You can get a version of the abstract, as well as some links, which I'm going to mention, some 2 visualizations that I'm going to be talking about in my talk. So what is stylometry? We have only 2 people speaking about stylometry at this entire Congress. One is a paper, the other is myself, also known as computational stylistics. It's a way of looking at common features across a corpus without encoding, right? Without annotation. The features that I have studied in the case of my corpus coming from medieval Spanish and medieval Latin are most frequent words. I call it a kind of democratic approach to stylometry. I use, for the purposes of today's talk, the package called Stilo in the programming language R. My case study is the Bocados de Oro, which many of you may know, classic text in the rise of Castellano prose in the 13th century. It typically fits inside of the literature of sabiduría, of sapiencial, of wisdom literature. It's called rather a spacious category. But in fact, it's actually one step on an entire chain of translations that lead us from Fatimid Egypt in the 11th century all the way to the first text published in English with a date in Britain, the Dixon sayings of the philosophers at the time of William Caxton. So these texts here, the Mukhtar Hikam Muhasam Akilam, Bocados de Oro, Libro Forum Antiquorum, etc., the Dimero di Philosophe, etc. These are the texts in that chain. I'm going to be speaking today about the Bocados de Oro and the Liber Philosophorum. So what we're looking at really is a translingual case study. Stylometry is not meant or does not function translingually, but we can think translingually using stylometry by studying a set of contexts, of unilingual contexts. And this is what I've done today. My idea in using stylometry is as a form of modeling. Modeling here, usually they use stylometry in a kind of forensic, literary way, looking for authorial attribution. There are, however, in traductology, translation studies, many new applications for this. Stylometry, it should always be taken as heuristic. It's a very, in some ways, approximative field. It really gives us a very nice, big picture, suggestive view. It also needs to be done iteratively, I believe iteratively, at the same time that we're creating our corpus, and thinking about how literature as a system, to use the words of Claudio Guillen, right? That a literature as a system changes the way that we think about the relationship of the parts. I think it's also best used when in a direct relationship with what we actually know about literary history. So a nice quote from Willard McCarty's Humanities Computing, just re-released last year: iterative modeling does not give us a more perfect picture, but rather yields, quote, temporary states in a process of coming to know, unquote. So a general hypothesis in stylometry is that the more frequent words that you have in common between texts gives us some kind of textual affinity, if you like, or some kind of stylistic affinity. And I use stylistic in parentheses or in quotation marks because we need to talk about what that means. My specific hypothesis is that translation is actually the first step in transmission. And so that if we think about the original contexts of the unilingual context in which we have these texts, we might know something more about a medieval textual transmission. This is a quote, this is actually from Ernst Robert Curtius's European Literature in the Latin Middle Ages. He talks about aerial photography at the end of the Second World War as having revolutionized archaeology. And the question that I'd like to pose to you today is, does such a distant view, right, that revolutionized archaeology, could that be possible in the case of stylometry with literary history? So some problems with literary history and medieval stylometry. Medieval texts, as I said, often stylometry is used for authorship attribution. Medieval texts are usually anonymous. Literary historians call them coming from schools, if we talk about translations, rather sort of loose groups of people. We don't really know very much about the emergence of such texts. We also have to remember that the societies in which these texts emerged were also multilingual. So they were Latin and they were Castellano in this particular case, but in different places across Europe or in the Mediterranean, that multilingualism changes. And they also have a high degree of variance. So towards another definition of style, I would highly recommend a new article by Herman van Dalen and Schuch that has just come out in Journal of Literary Theory, 2015, in which they're looking at style as countable features of texts rather than something essential coming out of a human being's ability to write. In stylometry, in particular, we're interested in things like bags of words. Bolsa de palabras. I don't know if you say that in Spanish, but bags of words. The idea is non-semantic, non-annotated. You throw all the words in, you tokenize them, and you count them up. And the problem with this kind of study is that we're not focusing on semantically important words. We normally think in literary studies about words that that have themes attached to them or that fit inside of certain semantic fields, and this is not the case here. We're often working with function words and the relative frequency of function words. So I invite you now to open, if you have a device with you, tinyurl.com/HDH for us today and Bocaros, because that's in my talk number 1, and you can actually see this is a Sigma.js export from Gephi of what the stylometry of this particular corpus of more than 60 texts actually looks like. I'm going to open that now, and hopefully we will see it. This is, you have here, if you like to play around, you can download the Gephi file yourself and check it out in Gephi. So you can also zoom in and zoom out. So what we're looking at here is this 60+ texts of mid-13th to late 14th century texts, about 5.6 million words total, and some 7 communities of text detected by a community algorithm inside of Gephi. What's interesting about this particular text, this corpus was constructed largely from the Madison Hispanic Seminary corpus of medieval Spanish. What's interesting about it is the extent to which we see topical clusters. We see things like historical and legal texts. We see regional texts like those coming from Navarro and Aragon. We see single author texts, the Gonzalo Berceo cluster, which is over here, actually. Let me see. It's funny how when you have something on the front of your screen, you don't even see it anymore. Well, anyway, I'll let you find it. And then you see also scientific texts. And this is typical of stylometry, that we have kind of overlapping signals. dependent upon the kind of corpus that's been constructed. Here we have an overlapping signal between certain kinds of legal texts and scientific texts. What I'm interested in, however, is the idea of sapiential literature, and how sapiential literature as a latter category, a modern category, tries to embody, or tries to encompass a whole body of texts which don't fit inside of it when then we look at it stylometrically. The interesting thing for me also about this text is the Bocados de Oro, right? Which if we find it here, the Bocados, that's the Kalila Wadimna. The Bocados, it says Alfonso, shouldn't say Alfonso, should say Anonymous, is actually not of Alfonso el Sabio. The Bocados de Oro is a little bit earlier, and if you look at standard literary histories in Spanish, this is not a text which is at the center. And yet, interestingly enough, when we look at this text and its relationship with all kinds of other texts, it really finds itself at the center. And so the idea that such a central text coming from Arabic needs, if you like, a kind of recontextualization is very interesting to me for Spanish. I'm going to go back to my original here, and I'm going to look at, that was my slide. In Latin, you can do the same URL, Bocados, instead of one, Bocados dos, two. And we can see here, this is actually just a small subset. This is a much larger corpus, about 120 texts from Latin. It's a little bit, has a hard time fitting on the screen, about 4 million words. It's a different situation in stylometry because of the spatial temporal breadth of Latin. We have texts that go far back in time, even some texts that post-date the Bocados. What I'm interested in here is I'm interested in the extent to which, and you can search by it, right? So the Liber Philosophorum, we're going to see what we get, right? Doesn't like that. Liber Philosophorum is the extent to which that, like in the Spanish case, gets associated with popular piety, here with the sermons of Albertano Rupresha. So I'm interested in the way in which stylometry can point us toward potential sets of readership, or potential, if you like, I call them discursive communities that can exist over time, that help us think about and rethink the categories, the generic categories that are placed upon literary history in the present. And in the particular case of this text, since we probably know that the Spanish and the Latin were composed in the 13th century, we don't know if the Latin was composed out of the Spanish or if it was actually co-composed with the Spanish. One of the things that my research tends to point to is, if you look here, its relationship to the two different versions of the Kalila Wadimna, one by a Jewish converso named John of Capua from Italy, and the other anonymous one composed under Ferdinand III, that are the affiliation or the affinity with the one under Ferdinand III is much stronger than the Italian version. So I think that what stylometry has allowed me to do is not only rethink genre, but actually help me point to not exactly the date, but the provenance of the Bocados de Oro being in Spain, not in Italy. And so with that, let me just conclude with my last slide. And results that the division of the corpus from the Hispanic seminary does not necessarily correspond to the kind of division of a corpus that stylometric analysis provides us. We see a really interesting relationship between this sapiential literature and popular piety, which is not usually mentioned by literary historians. We also don't see a specific signal of Arabic textuality. Right? Things translated from Arabic don't show up together somehow. There's a kind of smoothing over of a diction in this particular period. It helps us think about history of literature, literary history, and reorient the Bocados de Oro and its Latin version inside of Spain. And I think perhaps important for those of you who are not medievalists, who know Juan Manuel or Juan Ruiz. And one of the most interesting things about the case of the Spanish text is, if we go back to, let's see if I can get back to it, is how amazingly, I think I put it in, did I put it in Español or Castellano? Castellano, there we go. Is how amazingly close Ruiz and Manuel are inside of this sapiential literature. So it points to this kind of, and they're much later, obviously, than this. So it points to a kind of reading community, right, that actually corresponds to Margaret Parker's thesis about El Conde de Lucanor as being somehow the culmination of such a tradition. Thank you very much.
Tenemos 2 minutos para una pregunta. I'm sure that David can take a question in Spanish or in English.
I can listen. Yeah, fine. I think Jose had.
Okay, go there.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for the beautiful documents. That is even we can even search for the names. It's very useful. I had 2 questions. One is about the parameters that you have used.
Yep.
I am reading here that you have used 100 to 1000.
Right.
So you have actually used only the functional words.
Correct.
Have you tried to, let's say, till 5,000 words, so more semantic words were included, or did you do it in purpose?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. The description on the Sigma JS export, right, is specifically what this data set is, right? So it was for the purposes of one visualization, right? And I really do believe that, as you're saying, a kind of iterative one which moves both down and up in terms of numbers of words, aiming at different sets, right, or different slices, if you like, of shared words is really important to do. I haven't gone to 5,000. No, I really haven't done that. I have gone lower, and what I found is that the low, that, you know, obviously you don't, if you go below 100 or 200, it's not terribly meaningful. But between 200 and 1,000, there's not a lot of change. This is, for me, this is a kind of, this is a case study where digital humanities, or rather computational methods in the digital humanities, is extremely useful for the exploration of terrain that is really uncharted, or that for which one doesn't have a lot of literary historical evidence. And so this is really just, for me, a kind of first pass through this particular question. I have, for this, there's an Arabic, there's a Spanish, there's a Latin, there's a French, and there's an English version of this. And so if you think that with that kind of translinguality, you get into really tricky questions. And you're totally right that each language is going to have to be adjusted in a slightly different way, right? Because Latin's inflected, Spanish is not, French is much more, there's a whole lot more variance in French spelling, etc., etc. So I haven't gone that far, but definitely I will.
Do I have time for another question?
This is a very quick one, please.
I find it incredible that you have found so many texts in Spanish to do this analysis, actually. And stylometry, if you have 2 texts where some words are modernized in a different way, stylometry is going to understand that these are two completely different words. So edition is actually a very important thing here, and more, of course, for medieval texts.
Right.
So is it a problem for your analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, the sort of the multilingual scope of the project has not made it. I've done much more experimentation on that in the French case than in the Spanish case. I chose to speak on the Spanish case here because that would probably be the thing that would be most interesting to people. But you're completely right that most medieval stylometry, the way that they authenticate, or the way that they decide that the process has been validated, is by going down to document level transcriptions, right? So you comb through a single instance of a document coming from an archive. Transliteration changes across different, as you said, different editions, but across different editors. I think different editorial principles all contribute to a noise here, right? That we have to listen to, not ignore. And so that's why I say also it's a suggestive. It's a suggestive practice. It points in certain directions, but the conclusions also have to be really taken with a grain of salt. That's definitely on my list of things to do, is to think about. And in particular, I think that one of the cases which becomes very interesting is that we have the Bocados de Oro. This is the Bonn edition, and then we also have the Parker edition. And I've got those in here, and there's a big difference in not the editorial policy, but in the OCR sort of correctness. And when the OCR correctness is much worse, as in the case of Parker, because it comes from microfilms from the Hispanic seminary in Madison, in that particular case, it's much less valid. I mean, the relationships between that text and others is really not at all the same represented formally.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
¿Cuánto se aprende en un congreso de humanidades digitales? Gracias a todos.